Charlie, great to see you again. I know it's been a couple of weeks since we had one of these conversations. How have you been, Charlie? How's everything?
Oh yeah, not too bad, not too bad. I was very much looking forward to our conversation today on the generational divide.
Yeah, another nice meaty topic, Charlie. I think one thing that jumps out at me, certainly since I moved into entrepreneurship or out of the traditional kind of working environment, is the ways in which we perceive these generational differences, and that way in which we perceive different generations does lead to inherent bias. And I think I've noted that a lot more since I jumped out, predominantly because in the entrepreneurial world there is kind of a bias toward kind of younger entrepreneurs, and the meetups that we go to leans younger generationally. But it got me thinking about, historically, as I've worked in organizations, what those biases are and whether or not those perceived differences across generations are real, Charlie. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's honestly one of the things that drives me absolutely insane when I hear it at work is like, oh, those millennials, they're da 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 da, or those Gen Z, they're blah 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 blah. And I think, to your point, it really kind of like how it creates this divide within a work culture, and it creates a bias in a work culture, which as leaders makes it incredibly hard to lead a group of people that you're not willing to empathize or understand where they're coming from. You, as a Gen X, as a baby boomer, have a certain frame of reference for how you experienced the world, how you problem solved, how you worked. And when you apply those values to a different generation, which grew up with different technology, different circumstances, different political, socioeconomic conditions, you end up in a place where you're creating much more of a divide between different kind of like age cohorts within a company.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlie. I think the way I look at this is that at our core, we've got far more similarities across generations than perhaps people believe we do. And I understand why that perception is there, because I guess at a more surface level, there are differences across the generations, right? In terms of how we communicate, in terms of how we work, or kind of our stability requirements within organizations, right? So some of these more surface level requirements and I suppose personality types come forth, and therefore most people within the workforce assume that there's great differences across these generations. But if you look at all generations, right from the boomers through to Gen Alpha, I think is the generation up and coming, and probably too early to see where they are from a working environment perspective. But I think purpose, right, is at the core of what every single generation needs in their professional life. I don't think that deviates or changes much across the board. Now, what I will say though, and I think this is a positive thing generally speaking, is that I've seen themes and trends that have shifted over time. Now, it's not to say that it's generation specific, but I think work-life balance, as an example, is becoming more and more important over time. I think social impact of an organization is becoming more front and center. Certainly, as I'm hiring, one of the questions that's consistently asked is, well, what's the mission of the organization? How do you give back? What's the purpose of your organization? I think that's becoming far more central and critical to the employee experience. And I think fixed employment to some extent is becoming, for me, less and less important, where fractional is taking off, entrepreneurism is growing, and people are now kind of seeing the value of that, I would say, slightly less rigid approach to the working world. So I do see themes, in other words, Charlie, even though there's commonalities across all generations.
Yeah, I think he says what you said around kind of like purpose, I think really is key there. But I do disagree with you around the fact that like I do think that baby boomers, for example, the purpose that they had versus the like work purpose that like millennials might have are very, very different, right? As a baby boomer, you're gonna go work for a company for 50 years, they'll pay you well, you can afford a house, you like are getting a pension, you have really good job security, and so your purpose for work is like that security, that thing, the thing that you actually know, right? Being able to take care of yourself and your family. As a millennial, pensions don't really exist anymore. People get laid, like there are layoffs that happen constantly. As a millennial, I've experienced like multiple economic crises that were allegedly once in a lifetime, and I don't see any end for those in sight. And so my purpose with work is to do something that's fulfilling for me, but also keep in mind that like I can't really rely, the conditions have changed, and I can't rely on one specific company to take care of me. I need to be able to like do that myself, take more agency in that. And that could mean like job hopping every few years, or it could mean having a more fulfilling work-life balance. Because for me, my priority is not necessarily having a family, it's having friends and like close relationships that are important to me.
So I think what I'm getting from this is that purpose is at the core of what everyone wants, but what that purpose is differs across different generations. So for me, your formative years and the era in which you grow up and are born, they drive your values, and that then drives your behaviors, and that can differ across generations. What I shift to then, Charlie, is, well, within the enterprise or within the working environment, then how do we ensure that, as opposed to creating these divides across these generations, we're creating symbiotic organizations, right? Where we're effectively getting the most out of all of these fantastic individuals. And I don't always see that, right? So in other words, I do think that there's inherent bias. And I do think that a lot of times we're almost pushing down whichever generation we don't exist in and not necessarily getting the best out of them. So what I believe we need is contextual leadership in a lot of ways, where we have leaders that acknowledge some of these differences, but can lead different styles and different types of individuals to maximize their satisfaction in work, and therefore kind of the performance of the organization.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely right. And to add a little bit more on top of that, I think as leaders, taking a really large step back from just where you are as running a company or running a team, and realizing that like human nature and the way that people act with this type of thing has not changed for 2000 years. This is something I'm personally very, very interested in. So I went back and I found examples from Aristotle and Plato, who are writing about the fact that like kids today are not da 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 like my generation was. You go back to, I found this really interesting article from the Times of London in the early 1800s that said kids today are relying on pencil and paper to do their notes. They don't know how to write on slate using chalk anymore. What are they going to do when the paper runs out, right? My point in this is that like as leaders, taking a really large step back and realizing every generation has a problem with the generation that comes after them is just like a universal truth across the world throughout the entirety of time. Once you recognize that, you can kind of like dive a little bit more into it and really kind of understand, to your point, like the motivations that a millennial is going to have will be different than a Gen Xer, will be different than a baby boomer. So understanding motivations, incentives, and how to like help bridge some of those things is the way as leaders, I think you can start to bridge some of that kind of like generational divide.
Yeah.
But it all starts with really it all starts with empathy. It's understanding, like really empathizing with your Gen Zers, your millennials, that like the technology environment they grew up in, the socioeconomic environment they grew up in shaped their values, shaped how they interact, and shaped how their purpose at work. When you understand those things, it's a lot easier to connect and relate to them and to motivate in more appropriate ways.
Yeah. So if I ever catch you saying kids these days, or that younger generation, and shaking your hand and head, I should give you a nudge, Charlie, which is the tendency, you're right, that everyone has, is to look at the next generation. I know I've been caught foul of that myself, but I'll keep an eye on that for sure, Charlie.
It's definitely something that I call people out on constantly, whether it's in a social situation or
Yeah.
especially work situations. It's and I just have to say this, like one of my favorite is that millennials are super entitled. They want everything like handed to them. Tell me like Gen Xers and baby boomers don't have people of the same ilk who don't want things handed to them, who don't like believe they're entitled to certain things. It has much less to do with generation, and it has much more to do with like an individual's capacity for empathy, their purpose, the context in which they grew up in. So I would encourage you, and like really anyone listening to this, like always be skeptical whenever you hear those things, because if someone's saying that, it generally means they're not empathizing with like whatever is different than the frame of reference that they have.
Yeah. And I think fear of change breeds that also, Charlie, right? We're comfortable with who we are, with what we grew up with. We understand the ecosystem and the environment in which we exist. And there's always that kind of, seismic shift as the new generations move forward. So I think fear of change also breeds that, maybe not contempt, but certainly that anxiety about what the younger generation may bring. And then, Charlie, that brings me on to maybe the organization again, right? And tangible kind of ways in which we can kind of maybe um, prevent this generational bias from impacting organizations. 8 in 10 individuals and leaders specifically feel the generational bias is a challenge and a problem within their organization, but less than half of these organizations have generational bias as part of their DEI initiatives, right? So it's a lot of awareness, it seems, but very little in terms of tactics to actually solve for these challenges across the organization. Have you experienced that at all, Charlie, in your professional life? And if so, what do you suggest leaders listening do to potentially block some of these biases that may impact their people and their organizations?
I've definitely encountered ageism, both on kind of like the more junior or the more senior level. There's certain perceptions there. I would say, as leaders, really keying into kind of like phrases or things that people are saying and calling them out and creating an active culture where people are questioning, like, oh, well, why do you think that like being young or like being in this generation, like they can't do this job? What is it about that, right? You're probably going to find that it has more to do with kind of like, to your point, fear of change, right? The next generation grew up in an environment that you can't understand because you did not grow up in it, right? And so there's this inherent uncertainty as a previous generation looking back of like, I don't understand how they got this way. And so as human beings, like, uncertainty breeds fear, right? And fear is the thing that ultimately kind of starts to contribute towards this young person can't work out, this older person can't work out, blah 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 blah. So being really aware, being really mindful of how people talk about age, how they talk about generational divides, and being the person that's really pushing forward for like, well, actually, these are all the things that they have in common, I feel is a really kind of like strong way to build those bonds, to build that connective tissue between
Yeah.
people in an organization.
I think it's being purposeful as well, right? So if this is something, and it likely is, that exists in most organizations, let's be purposeful in terms of building that framework to ensure that this perception doesn't become reality within organizations. And there's a whole host of different ways in which we can do that, Charlie. We can facilitate multi-generational collaboration sessions, right? What one generation brings doesn't necessarily come easily to another generation. Let's bring them together in a purposeful way to create greater innovations within organizations. Let's encourage non-traditional mentoring sessions. Some of the companies that I worked for had non-traditional sessions in the sense that we would have younger generations coaching and fostering that mindset with perhaps the older generation. And it really created that empathy within organizations. So I would say yes to all of the points that you raised, in addition to creating purposeful frameworks and programs within your organization to ensure that this actually manifests into your culture across the board. Well, another fascinating conversation. If you were to leave our listeners with one or two specific points that they should take back to their organization, what would they be?
I would say, like, number one, be really mindful of when you hear people talking about other individuals in a certain way. And number two, keep in mind that like people have, this generation has an issue with this generation because of certain behaviors that they're doing, but those behaviors are rooted in the values that they have. So understanding the next generation's values or individuals' values, which ultimately drives a lot of the other behavior that they have, is going to be, like, I think, one of the main ways to make sure that the connection happens, engagement, and better performance.
Fantastic. Yeah, wonderful stuff, Charlie. It's been a pleasure as always, Charlie. Let's not leave it so long until the next conversation. Thank you so much for spending this 30 minutes with us.
Absolutely. Great to chat with you.
Cheers, Charlie.
Yep.